I married young, barely after celebrating my 21st birthday. It was the most beautiful and exciting time of my life, full of dreams and expectations. His name was Mike, and he was 13 years older than me. To me, that felt like an advantage. He was mature, confident, experienced, everything the young men of my age lacked, who were usually preoccupied with themselves. Mike knew how to win me over. He was persistent without being pushy, attentive without being overbearing. It seemed like he could read me, anticipating my desires even before I was fully aware of them. We met by chance at a friend's party in the suburbs of Denver. I remember him standing at the bar, talking to one of our mutual friends. Tall, fit, with a wide smile, he was the embodiment of confidence. His gaze caught mine instantly, and when he came over to introduce himself, I already knew something special was about to happen. Everything progressed quickly, almost like in a fairy tale. We started dating, and 6 months later, Mike proposed. It was both unexpected and completely natural. I didn't even hesitate. I still look back at our wedding with warmth. It was a small celebration, but full of love. We got married at the end of summer, when the sun bathed everything in its warm light. My mom cried when she saw me in my wedding dress, and my dad, for the first time in a long while, looked genuinely happy. Mike couldn't take his eyes off me, and I felt like the most beautiful woman in the world. After the wedding, we began our life together. We settled into a cozy home in the suburbs of Seattle. Mike worked hard. He owned his own construction company, and things were going well. I took care of the house, enjoying the quiet and the calm routine of our life. In the evenings, we had dinner together, discussed our future plans, and talked about having children. Those conversations always warmed my heart. We dreamed of a big family, of how our children would run through the green lawn behind the house, playing with the dog Mike promised to get. At first, everything was perfect. Mike surrounded me with attention and care, constantly reminding me of how much he loved me. He often said that I was his greatest luck, that he never believed he would meet a girl like me. I was happy, and every day I thanked fate for bringing me such a person. But, as it often happens, over time, our life became a little more monotonous. It didn't seem like a problem. We simply got used to each other, began to focus more on tasks than on romance. Mike was immersed in work, and I took care of the house, occasionally taking on small freelance projects to keep from feeling completely detached from the world. I thought it was normal after all. Real love isn't always about passion and butterflies in your stomach. It's about stability, trust, and living together. The first signs of trouble appeared when our attempts to have a child failed. I didn't immediately realize how important it was to both of us. Each month, each negative pregnancy test became a bigger disappointment. Mike comforted me, saying it would happen, that we just needed to wait. But I could see how harder it became for him to hide his frustration. He didn't say it out loud, but I felt that he was struggling. These failures became the first shadow in our marriage. 3 years passed, then 4. I went from doctor to doctor, trying everything I could. Mike supported me, but with each passing year, it felt like his support was becoming more distant, more formal. He spent more time at work, and at home, he became quiet and somewhat detached. Sometimes, I felt like there was an invisible wall between us, but I couldn't figure out how to break it down. We almost stopped talking about children, as if we were avoiding the topic to avoid hurting each other. On our 5th wedding anniversary, I finally got pregnant. It was a joy so overwhelming it's hard to put into words. I remember the day I showed Mike the positive test. His eyes filled with tears, and he hugged me so tightly, as if afraid I might disappear. He said it was the best thing that could ever happen to us, that everything would change now. And I believed him. I believed that our child would be a new chapter in our lives, bringing back everything we had lost. But reality proved more complicated. The pregnancy wasn't easy. I was constantly tired, anxious about the baby's health. Each day was filled with fears and worries. At first, Mike was attentive, but soon he started complaining that I wasn't giving him enough attention. He said he missed our time together, that I was too focused on the baby. Those words hurt me, because I was doing everything to keep our family strong. But I couldn't stop thinking about the tiny life growing inside me. That was the most important thing. Jake was born a month before our 6th wedding anniversary. He was the longed-for, prayed-for child. I looked at him and thought that now, our life would surely get better. But Mike didn't seem to share my excitement. He was happy during the first few weeks, but soon began to distance himself. I chalked it up to exhaustion, to stress, but deep down, I felt something else was going on. When Jake was just 2 months old, I discovered something about Mike that struck me like a blow. I saw a message on his phone by accident. It was from a woman who wrote that she missed him and wanted to see him again. My heart stopped. I couldn't believe that the person I had considered my partner could do this. From the moment I saw that message on Mike's phone, my life split into before and after. I sat in the kitchen, holding his phone, trying to process what I had just read. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it could be heard through the walls. Thoughts swirled in my head. How could he? Why did he do this? What did I do wrong? I wanted to confront him immediately, demand an explanation, but instead, I was paralyzed by numbness. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jake woke up several times, and I fed him, rocked him in my arms, trying to focus on the baby instead of the emotions flooding through me. Mike came home late, as always, explaining it was a late meeting. His indifference at that moment tore me apart from the inside. I didn't tell him I knew. I just looked at him and thought about how wrong I had been, about the man who was supposed to be my husband. The next day, I finally decided to talk about it. It wasn't a hysterical outburst, as he might have expected. I calmly told him that I knew about his meetings with another woman. His face went pale, but he immediately started defending himself. It doesn't mean anything. It was just a mistake. It happened only once. I love only you and Jake. He begged me to forgive him, promising to end it all right away. And you know, in that moment, I believed him. Or maybe I just wanted to believe that everything could still be fixed. I thought about Jake. He was only 2 months old. He deserved to have his father by his side, strong and reliable. I couldn't destroy our family so quickly without giving Mike a chance to fix things. I forgave him. But I can't say it was a sincere forgiveness. Inside me, a worm of doubt took root, and with each passing day, it gnawed at me more and more. We tried to live as we had before, but it was difficult. I noticed how Mike more often avoided my gaze, how our conversations became shallow. I felt unloved, unnecessary. Every late phone call or work delay filled me with anxiety, but I stayed silent. I tried to be strong for Jake, to maintain the appearance of a family. Months passed. Jake was growing, and I felt more and more like our family was becoming an empty shell. Mike was saying, "I love you," less and less. He would pick at me over trivial things, accusing me of not giving him enough attention. I tried to change the situation. I cooked dinners, tried to look the way he liked, neatly done hair, light makeup, but none of it mattered. We had become strangers. A few months after our first serious argument, I saw messages in his phone again. This time, it was a different woman. They exchanged photos, flirted, and I could tell it was more than just friendly banter. My hands trembled as I read those messages. I wanted to scream, wake him up, and ask how he could do this again. But instead, I quietly placed the phone back. The next morning, when I brought it up, he started defending himself, saying it was just virtual nonsense, that he'd never met her in real life. He claimed he just needed to feel like a man, a hunter. His words were pathetic, but something in them broke me. I no longer felt anger or hurt, just emptiness. Our arguments became routine. Any little thing could set us off. I tried to talk to him, to understand what was tearing us apart, but he just got angry and walked away. I became more and more withdrawn, feeling my love for him fading away. Occasionally, he would show glimpses of the old Mike, buying flowers, telling me he loved me, but I couldn't believe him anymore. Every time I looked at him, those women he'd been messaging appeared before my eyes. By the time Jake turned 1, I was deep in depression. My reflection in the mirror seemed like that of a stranger. I had once been a confident girl who knew what she wanted. Now I saw a tired woman with dull eyes, afraid of each new day. Mike probably noticed it, but did nothing. He lived his life, and I lived mine. We were no longer a team. One day, after yet another argument, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. But instead of leaving the room as I would have before, I wrote a message. Not to Mike, but to Robert. I hadn't expected one simple message to Robert to change so much. We had met before Jake was born, back when I was desperately trying to distract myself from the struggles of conception. It had been on one of those forums where people discussed books, movies, and shared stories. Robert had turned out to be an intelligent conversationalist who always found interesting topics to talk about. Our communication back then had been light, friendly, and had no strings attached. But that night, everything was different. I wrote to him because I felt completely lost. I had nowhere else to turn. Should I tell my parents? They would only get angry at Mike and possibly start pressuring me to leave. Friends? I didn't want to hear any more advice starting with, "You just need to talk to him." I had already tried talking. It hadn't worked. The message to Robert turned out to be surprisingly candid. I told him how I felt invisible, how tired I was of loneliness, and how afraid I was that my life would never change. I feared he might think I was overreacting, or that he'd get tired of hearing my complaints. But his reply was immediate, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. Robert wrote that I was strong, that my pain was justified, and that I didn't have to carry this burden alone. His words moved me to tears. It was like a breath of fresh air after being locked in a stuffy room for so long. He listened to me, without interrupting, without offering advice, just being there. For the first time in a long while, I felt like someone saw me, understood what I was going through. Our communication became regular. Every night, after Jake had fallen asleep, I would write to him. Sometimes they were long messages where I poured my heart out. Other times, short notes about how the day had gone. He always responded, asked questions, genuinely cared about my life. I started looking forward to our conversations because they became the only bright spot in my days. Mike, of course, didn't notice anything. He was too absorbed in his own life to see that I was spending more and more time with my phone in my hands. In his eyes, I was still the woman who stayed home with the baby and didn't contribute. He continued acting as though I should be grateful he was even around. His criticism and disregard no longer made me angry, just indifferent. With each passing day, Robert became more important to me. I knew that our communication had started to go beyond simple friendship, but I couldn't stop. He understood me in ways Mike never had. He asked me about my dreams, about what I wanted out of life. No one had asked me those questions in years. I remembered how I had once dreamed of becoming an interior designer, of opening my own small studio. Those dreams had long been left behind, but Robert made me think about the fact that I could still live for myself, not just for others. At some point, we began exchanging pictures. At first, they were harmless snapshots, his mountain hikes, my morning cups of coffee in the kitchen. Then, the photos became a little more personal. I sent him a picture of me smiling at Jake while holding him in my arms. Robert told me that I looked happy, but there was sadness in my eyes. Those words struck me because he saw something I wasn't ready to admit to myself. Robert told me about his life. He lived in San Diego, worked at a tech company, and loved to travel. He had a brother they were close with, and a dog named Bailey. His life seemed so simple and clear, and I envied him. I couldn't imagine someone like him could genuinely be interested in me. I often asked myself why I was still with Mike. The answer was simple: Jake. I didn't want to take his father away from him. I didn't want to shatter his world. But inside, I began to realize that by staying with Mike, I was destroying myself. I couldn't ignore the fact that Robert had become something more to me than just a friend. That terrified me. I didn't want to betray Mike, but I wasn't sure anymore if I still loved him. One day, after a particularly tough day, I gathered the courage to call Robert. It was the first time we spoke on the phone instead of messaging. His voice was soft, soothing. We talked for over an hour, and I felt with each word that my soul was lightening. He didn't do anything special. He just listened, and for the first time in a long while, I felt important. From that moment on, our conversations became a habit. I still avoided meeting in person. It felt wrong, even like a betrayal. But I could no longer ignore the fact that my marriage to Mike had been broken long before I met Robert. He had simply become the one to help me see the truth. I still clung to hope. Hope that Mike would change, that his feelings for me would come alive again, that he would become the man who had fallen in love with me years ago. Those were weak, fragile dreams, but I held on to them for Jake's sake, to give him the stability he deserved. I tried to make excuses for Mike, his exhaustion, stress at work, the pressure of responsibility. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that maybe it was me who wasn't doing enough. Maybe I wasn't a good enough wife. But even with those thoughts, I could no longer ignore the truth. Every look he gave me, every phone call, every delay at work, it all pointed to the fact that he was somewhere else. I tried to turn a blind eye, but the deception became too obvious. One morning, while I was preparing breakfast for Jake, Mike, as always, was getting ready for work. His phone rang, lying on the table. He usually answered it right away, but this time, when he saw the name on the screen, he quickly pressed the decline button and shoved the phone into his pocket. It seemed like a small thing, but in that moment, I felt something break inside me. I couldn't live in ignorance anymore. That evening, when Mike went to bed before me, I took his phone. There was no password. He probably didn't even think I might check. I opened his messages and saw what I feared to find. On the screen, there were explicit exchanges with a woman I didn't know. She told him she missed him, that she longed for him to be there. Mike responded with the same tenderness and passion I hadn't seen in our relationship for a long time. Each message cut through me like a knife. "You make me happy," he wrote to her. I looked at those words, and my chest tightened. These were the words I had wanted to hear from him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just sat in the dark, feeling my whole life falling apart. Jake was sleeping in his crib, his quiet breathing reminding me that I had to be strong, but in that moment, I didn't know how to put myself back together. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I asked Mike directly, "Who is she?" His face first went pale, then filled with anger. He accused me of violating his privacy, saying it was just meaningless chatter. His excuses were as empty as his words of love over the past months. I couldn't listen to him anymore. I simply said I couldn't live like this anymore and left the room. I expected him to come after me, to try to talk, but he stayed where he was. The silence became the strongest proof to me that our marriage was truly over. In those days, I wrote to Robert more and more. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't pressure me, didn't try to convince me of anything. He just listened and supported me. I told him what I had found on Mike's phone and how it had shattered me. Robert responded that I didn't deserve that kind of treatment, that I was a strong woman, and I needed to think about what was best for me and Jake. His words touched me deeply. I began to realize that Robert had become more than just a friend to me. He had become the one who saw me for who I was and accepted me without judgment. I knew it was wrong, that my communication with him was a kind of escape from reality, but I couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Mike became more and more distant. His occasional bursts of attention to Jake and me seemed forced. I understood that he no longer felt for me what he once did. I tried to hold the family together, but I began to ask myself more and more, who am I doing this for? And one day I realized that my answer was fear. I was afraid of being alone, afraid of what people would say about a single mother who couldn't keep her marriage intact. I was afraid that Jake would grow up, blaming me for taking his father away. But even more, I was afraid that by staying with Mike, I would lose myself completely. More and more often, I caught myself thinking about Robert. His words echoed in my mind. His kindness and care became the source of strength I needed. I knew he would like to meet in person, but I couldn't allow myself that yet. For me, it would be a step I wasn't ready to take. Life had become a routine where I existed only for Jake. Mike remained distant, and his attention felt artificial. He tried to create the illusion of a caring father, but behind his words and actions, I didn't see sincerity. We were no longer partners. We simply lived under the same roof, each with our own thoughts and secrets. My communication with Robert had become constant. We texted every day, sometimes for hours. He was the only one who made me feel alive. I shared my struggles, my fears, my dreams with him. Robert listened, supported, and never judged. His kindness became my anchor. Soon, I noticed that I was avoiding time with Mike. I waited until he left for work to text Robert and put my phone away when Mike came home. It felt like a double life, but I didn't feel guilty. Mike had long made his choice. His betrayals weren't just mistakes. They were conscious choices that he repeated time and time again. Sometimes, in moments of weakness, I asked myself, why was I still with him? Why was I allowing myself to be unhappy, clinging to a marriage that meant nothing anymore? The answers were always the same: Jake, fear, habit. I thought about the future, about how divorce would change our lives. I was afraid Jake would grow up without his father, that he wouldn't understand my decision. Mike, meanwhile, seemed to live as though nothing had happened. He avoided any discussions about us. Sometimes, his indifference was replaced by sudden bursts of attention, as if he was trying to convince himself and me that we were still a family. But these moments were brief and meant nothing. I tried to find a way out. I thought maybe if I tried to change myself, it would bring something back into our relationship. I started caring more about my appearance, cooking his favorite dishes, engaging in conversations about his work, but nothing changed. He took my efforts for granted, and that only deepened my sense of being unnecessary. One night, I was looking through his phone again. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. His messages were deleted, and the communication apps were locked with a password. That was telling enough. He wasn't trying to justify himself anymore. He was just hiding what he was doing. That night, I felt for the first time that it was truly over. I couldn't fight anymore. My marriage to Mike had become empty and barren, like a field after a long drought. Everything I had done to keep the family together had been in vain. He didn't want to change. He didn't want to save us. My connection with Robert had grown deeper. I knew he wanted to meet, but I wasn't ready for that. It felt like the final step I still couldn't take. We continued communicating through texts and calls. Robert told me about his life, shared his plans, and asked about Jake. He was the one I wanted by my side, but fear of change still held me back. Mike, meanwhile, spent more and more time at work or went on business trips. I stopped asking where he was going or why. The answers didn't matter anymore. I knew he was lying, but I saw no point in starting another fight. All we had left was a formal connection for Jake's sake. One evening, when Mike again didn't come home, I looked at Jake, playing with his toys on the carpet. His laughter filled the room, but instead of joy, all I felt was pain. I saw how his little world revolved around me, how dependent he was on my mood, on my state of being. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Robert suggested meeting again. He said he wanted to support me, be there for me. I thought long and hard about his words. Everything seemed so complicated. I knew that meeting him in person couldn't just be seen as a friendly gesture anymore. But I also knew that I couldn't keep deceiving myself and living in this broken marriage. When Mike called for the first time after I moved back to my parents' house, I was surprised. He didn't use loud words, didn't try to justify himself. His voice sounded tired, as if he had already accepted defeat. But at the end of the conversation, he said something that made me stop. "Jake needs a father, and you're the only person I've ever loved." Those words echoed in my head long after I hung up. I thought I had already made my decision, that with Robert, I could finally start a new, better life. But it wasn't that simple. Mike's words reminded me that despite all the pain he caused, he was still part of my life. We had built a family together, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't just erase that from my memory. Robert saw my doubts. He didn't pressure me, but I knew his patience wasn't endless. In his eyes, I saw the question, "Why are you still thinking about the person who destroyed your life?" But the answer was too complicated for me. Mike was Jake's father. He was my first love, and despite all the pain, I couldn't stop hoping he would change. A few weeks later, I returned home. Mike met me at the door, and I saw the same tiredness in his eyes that I had heard in his voice. He didn't hug me, didn't say anything grand. He simply said, "I'm glad you're back." At first, he truly tried. He spent more time with Jake, was attentive to me. We talked about the future, about how we would rebuild our family. But it was an illusion. I could see that he was struggling, fighting with himself. A few months later, everything returned to the way it was. Late calls, work delays, sudden trips. His phone once again became a mystery to me, but I no longer searched for answers. I knew that behind the screen, it was the same lie, the same betrayals. I could feel myself slowly fading away. Each day felt like the one before. Jake, housework, the rare conversations with Mike. I tried to talk to him, to explain how much it hurt, but he would just get irritated, avoiding answers. Robert no longer wrote. I stopped communicating with him as soon as I decided to return. It felt like the right thing to do, but I could feel something inside me snap. Robert had been my light, but I chose the darkness. I chose my family. Sometimes at night, sitting in the kitchen, I would think about how my life could have been. I imagined myself in another city, with a different destiny, free from this constant feeling of pain and loneliness. But those thoughts would quickly fade, leaving behind only emptiness. Every morning I would start with a smile for Jake. He was my only salvation, my only joy. For him, I got up, made breakfast, cleaned the house. For him, I endured Mike, his indifference, and his lies. Over time, I realized that this would always be the case. Mike would never change. But I no longer hoped for that. My life had become a chain of compromises, where I gave up on myself for the appearance of family. I chose suffering because I couldn't choose freedom.